Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you are. As you heard already, my name is Dr. Nick Wake. I'm a professor of operations and supply chain management. And my goodness, what an exciting time to be in operations and supply chain management. I graduated from my first degree 30 years ago. And if someone had told me 30 years ago that I would be spending most of my time in public buildings wearing a mask, and actually most of my teaching this year would be done via Zoom, I would have laughed because I would not have expected it. But yet here we are in this world which has changed radically in less than a year. And what I want to do with you guys for the next half an hour or so is to start to think about the impact of Corona on the global supply chains that we all live in. And having done that, to think about what's going to happen next, which I think is actually really important. That's a really important thing. But if we're going to understand what happens next, I think what we need to do, first of all, is to get a common understanding of where we are in global terms, in terms of supply chain. And just before the session, I walked over to my fruit bowl and I picked up some fruit. So I've got a mandarin, an apple, and a kiwi here. And one of the things that strikes me is that even the most basic products like this are the result of global supply chains. That was produced in Spain, that was produced in New Zealand, and I'm not sure where the country of origin of this is, actually, so I can't tell you that. But I think what we would all recognize is that there is a seamless, almost invisible supply chain that supports our every need globally. And the interesting thing for me is that products like this, products like, for example, fizzy water, are products that I can buy in every single country in the world. And the reason that that happens is because of these global supply chains. So I thought what I'd do is to, first of all, have a think about how we've got to where we are in terms of these global supply chains. What's allowed that to happen? Because that hasn't happened by accident. And having thought about that, what I'd like then to do is to say, what is driving our supply chains now? Because if we can understand that, that gives us a hook into the future that says, what are our supply chains going to look like in like 10 years time, in 2030? So I'm going to try and do some future gazing for you. So that's the objective really of the session. So we'll have a look at back in history and say, how do we get to where we are? Where are we now and what's driving us now? And what are things going to look like in the future? So let's get into it. First of all, I'm going to have a look at what has allowed these global supply chains to occur, because I've said already they haven't occurred by accident, and there are a number of enablers that have allowed global supply chains to spring up, particularly actually in the last 50 years. One of which is the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization allows organizations in different countries to interact and trade according to a common set of rules. And the WTO is very much about reducing the barriers to trade and allowing organizations to trade seamlessly against around the world of products and services. And I should just say that when I talk about supply chains, I'm talking about product and supply of services. So when some people think about supply chains, they think about the physical movement of goods, but actually the provision of services also occurs in global supply chains. So when I talk about supply chains, let's just remember we're talking about the supply chains that support the delivery of goods and services. So we've talked about the WTO. Global banking as well allows global supply chains to operate seamlessly. Things like letters of credit, which we take for granted, allow organizations to trade with little financial risk. The next thing that's enabled global supply chains actually is the promotion of world trade by governments. If you think about governments across the world, one of the things they want to do is to reduce the tariffs that stop trade, to reduce the barriers to trade and allow trade to occur freely. That's what's going on at the moment in the UK with Brexit. One of the things about Brexit is they're trying to create a deal that allows the United Kingdom and the European Union to trade seamlessly. You can probably tell by my accent I'm British. I should say that I was born in Switzerland. I have British and Irish nationality, and I live in the Netherlands. So I would say I was a good European first and probably British second, so I can see the both sides of the argument, and I know which side of the argument I'm on. The fourth thing that's allowed global trade to proliferate actually is the internet. And the internet has allowed organizations in different parts of the world to share very rich information very quickly across a unlimited number of platforms. And that's actually accelerated the ability of companies to interact and to talk globally. The next thing that's made a big difference as well is political and economic stability. I mean, it is no surprise to me whatsoever that like China produces a lot of the products that we buy in countries around the world, because it has a very, very stable political situation. And what that means is that if you're an organization that wants to go into partnership and you're thinking, well, this partnership's got to last 20 or 30 years, what you look for is you look for a company with a country with stability. And that's one of the things that a country like China has. Another enabler of global trade actually is the ability to protect your intellectual property. And intellectual property protection through patents has allowed, I would say historically, organizations to trade globally. I would question whether that's still the case today, but I'll come back to that. So these are some of the enablers of global trade. What are the forces of global trade? Because the enablers allow it to happen, but what are the things that actually really, really drive it? Another list of things here. I think one of the big things actually is labor cost differentials. If you can buy labor cheaper in another country, and you can produce a good or a service to the same quality, then there's a benefit to you of doing that. And labor cost differentials have actually made a really big difference to global trade. The next thing, if you're making products, is bulk shipping, and particularly the invention in the 1950s of the shipping container. The shipping container allowed standardization of shipped products to occur, which actually allowed companies to ship quicker, and actually has really driven global trade. So bulk shipping now is very cheap, it's very secure, and it's very rapid. So if you want to move a container of a product, say from China or South Africa to Europe, it's going to cost you maybe $1,000 in shipping costs, and that's made a really, really big difference. Another plank in this area is scale economy. So if you want to produce goods, particularly as cheaply as you can, then you need scale economy, not in all industries, but in some industries. And if you can ship your goods a long way cheaply, then it makes sense to play the scale economy game, which is I'm going to have a few manufacturing sites around the world where I can produce products at scale for low cost to make sure I maximize my profit. Take a company like IKEA, for example, very, very successful global company that enjoys scale economies and produces a lot of its goods in Eastern Europe, where labor is still quite cheap, and is able to produce them cheaply and in volume and ship them around the world at very little cost. So if you think about those first three things are driven actually very much by shareholder value creation. A lot of people argue that the number one primary priority in an organization is to maximize shareholder value. And the way that you do that is you buy labor cheaply, you create scale economy where it's efficient to do so. And if that means that you ship your product or service actually around the globe, then it makes sense to do that. So shareholder value creation has been a big force in globalization. The next one, actually interesting, I think, is taxation. I think this is a nefarious reason for globalization. But if you look at big global companies, they deliberately set themselves up in countries that minimizes their tax liability. So you see companies setting up in countries like the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands, or actually in the Netherlands sometimes, or in particular cantons in Switzerland, primarily because it's the most tax efficient way to run their organization. And again, if you think about globalization as the mobilization of goods and services, taxation and all of the way that these elaborate companies are set up, that is about the provision of services globally. And that's been a big driver of globalization. The next one actually is the network effect. So if we think about what the network effect is, the network effect says that there is a network benefit to co-locating your operation in a part of the globe where the product or service that you make is already being made. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Hollywood and actually Bollywood are big global centers of the creation of movies, because once you have an economy there that's based on a particular industry, as other players move in, you share the benefits of that network. Another reason why the big global financial hubs are New York, London, and Hong Kong, and other places, because once you set up that hub, you get the network effect. And that's true in many, many different types of operation and different type of business. Now, the last one, again, is a slightly strange one, but I think the other thing as well that happens sometimes is you get what I call the lemming effect. And the lemming effect says that companies will go for globalization because other companies in their industry are doing that. Now, that's not a good reason to do it. And actually, organizations have had their fingers burnt and they've done this. But a lot of organizations will set up and say, okay, because everyone else is offshoring to India or China, there's got to be a benefit of doing it, so we'll do that. And actually, one of the lessons I think companies have learned is that if the primary driver for globalization is cost saving, then often you don't get the benefit that you expect. Historically, these have been some of the forces of globalization. Let's look at what's happening now. What are the things which are shaping supply chains at the moment? I think number one on all of our minds at the moment is actually Corona. And I have a short poll here, which we're going to run, because I'm interested to know what the impact of Corona has been in the supply chain in which you currently operate. So we're going to open the poll now. And I'd like you to answer a question. I should say this is anonymous, so we're not going to capture this data against your name. But the question I'm really interested in getting an answer to for you guys is, what has the impact of Corona been on my business, on my supply chain? Have I seen demand increase? Have I seen no change in demand? Or have I seen, a small, a medium, or a very substantial change in demand for the product or the service that I produce? Because I think at the moment, Corona is making quite a big difference to global supply chains. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to vote, and then let's have a look at the answers to that question.
Yeah, so some last final decisions, please. All right, and here you go.
Thank you. So interestingly, about a third of you have said actually there's an increase for my product or service. And that's definitely true. If you work in things like pharmaceutical or food, for example, there's been an increase in demand. Actually, some of the tech giants like Amazon have seen an increase in demand because they're able to ship product when retail stores have been closed, for example. But actually the bulk of you, so that's 62% of you have said actually demand has gone down. And that's a really, that's a really, really significant impact in global economics, is demand for lots and lots of products and services have gone down. And this is having a really big impact on global supply chains. So if you work in the travel or the leisure industry, for example, if you work in air freight, or if you work in air services, demand has gone down substantially. If you work in retail, demand has gone down substantially. If you work in oil and gas, actually, demand has gone down. If you work in things like the creative arts industry, there have been really, really significant drops in demand. And that's one of the forces which is changing supply chains now. So it's interesting that, and it doesn't surprise me, there's this great big spread because you come from so many different parts of the world and work in so many different industries. So Corona is definitely having making a difference. I think the other thing that's making a difference as well is an increase in protectionism and popularism. If you look, for example, at some of the messages which are coming out of the United States government at the moment, there is a move towards repatriating manufacturing jobs to the United States. And that will have a very significant impact on global supply chains. If you look at what happened with Brexit in the UK, I mean, that's a story about the United Kingdom saying, actually, we want to limit the free movement of goods, services, and people. And that's a story about the impact on their supply chain. I think protectionism and particularly popularism is having an impact and will continue to have an impact on global supply chains. The next one, and I think this is actually one of the most significant, is the impact of Industry 4.0. So what we're seeing now is we're seeing the convergence of a number of different types of technology, which is radically altering supply chains. So, for example, 3D printing is a opportunity to radically disrupt supply chains, because if you can 3D print, you can create products in the area which they're needed, and actually that reduces, first of all, the need for scale economy, and secondly, reduces the requirement for global shipping. And as the cost of 3D printing goes down, demand will go up, and I think it will radically alter a number of significant supply chains. The second area in Industry 4.0 is robotics. I need to be honest and say I am slightly skeptical in this area, and the reason for that is because robotics has been around for a long time. If you go to an automotive plant, for example, robots have been making cars for a long, long time. So robotics isn't new. The mechanization of work actually isn't new. If you were to go to the first industrial revolution, which was when things like craft industries, like manufacture of fabric, went from being a craft industry and it started being done in mills, people said then, this is the end of work. We're mechanizing all of our work. If you look at the second industrial revolution, when the internal combustion engine actually changed the way that power was generated, people were saying the same things. This is going to radically alter the nature of work. Will there be jobs in the future? And we're having a similar debate now with robotics, but robotics is not new. Robotics has been around for 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, if you fly on a plane, planes are piloted by robots, by computer systems. So the idea that robotics is somehow new, to me, isn't true. I think what we're seeing actually is an acceleration of robotic technology, and for various other reasons I'll talk about in a moment. I think that there is some traction around here. I think the most significant area in terms of Industry 4.0 is in the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning. If you think about previous industrial revolutions, what we've seen is the mechanization of work that required muscle. So what we see is we see the mechanization of physical labor. I think what's different and radical here is we're seeing the mechanization and automation of knowledge work, so work that requires you to think. And that is very, very different. So for example, if you look at diagnostic imaging that occurs in hospitals, machines are now better at reading things like MRI scans in a way that they're able to diagnose breast cancer that is now done better by a machine than a human being. I mean, if you've spent all of your career, 10 or 15 years learning to be a radiographer or a radiologist, this is a massively disruptive piece of technology. And what we're going to see is artificial intelligence making headways in a number of other very significant areas where knowledge work is being replaced by artificial intelligence. And that's significant. The other forces which are changing the way we work at the moment are global warming, the requirement for increased environmental sustainability in the operations that we run and in the supply chains that we run. The other thing we're seeing as well is the increased importance of developing nations. And I think there are a couple of different areas here. I think as nations develop, their per capita GDP goes up, which means that their ability to buy products and services goes up. But also I think the nature of the work that's being undertaken is changing. If we were having this conversation maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we would have been looking at economies like China and saying that's where we do our cheap manufacturing. Actually, what we're seeing now is industries in places like China and India, for example, where knowledge work is being produced in these economies. And if you think about companies like Huawei, for example, what we're seeing is companies like Huawei setting up in countries like China and actually creating new products, because what's happening in those countries is that they're moving up the supply chain. They're not just manufacturing, they're actually owning the intellectual property, and they're producing new products and services, and that's significant. I think one of the other forces at the moment is intellectual property theft. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for organizations and individuals to protect their intellectual property. And if that's a problem, and it is, then you either stop producing that intellectual property, which you don't want to do, or you have to say, what are the things that we need to do to protect that intellectual property? Do we need to change the way that we operate? And that's definitely a current force. So those are what I think are the current forces in the shaping supply chains. I think there are some other forces in play. And again, we're going to go back to Corona as one of them. And I've got a second poll here, which I'd like to run, because I'm interested in understanding from your perspective about how long you think Corona will disrupt the supply chain in which you work. How much longer will it create a disruption? Because there are some people who are arguing it's going to be a very short-term disruption. There are other people that are saying this disruption will continue for a much longer period of time. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to think about that and to provide me with an answer, and then let's have a look at the answers and see what you guys have said.
Yeah, I can see it's a bit of a race here, so please make the last decision so that we maybe get some clearer results in the end. Okay.
Okay, so let's have a look at what you guys are saying. So some of you are saying actually the most popular answer is 6 months to a year, which is 32% of you, and then a 52% of you are saying it's over a year, and in fact 22%, so over a fifth of you are saying that supply chain disruption will last for more than 2 years. Some of you are saying actually it's 1 to 6 months. My perspective on this is that the long-term impact, that there will be a long-term impact on global supply chains caused by Corona. And I'm going to try and explain to you why that is. And having done that, I'm going to ask you, as we start to look at the future, to kind of conceptualize that a bit more and explain to me why you've come to that conclusion, because I'm interested in this spread, if you like. And for me, some of the issues around Corona has created societal changes. I mean, we've all got used to working from home, for example. And I think organizations are starting to recognize actually it's cheaper and easier to keep people at home. Let's get rid of these offices because they cost money. I think that one of the big changes actually is it's forced people to think about the stability and capability of their supply chains. And I think the reason for that is because global organizations have recognized that there are some weak links in their supply chain that have meant that it has substantially disrupted their operation. So I think from a medium to long-term perspective, companies will be starting to say, how can we reconfigure our supply chain in a way that manages our operation more effectively? And on top of that, I'm going to predict that governments will force new regulation into global supply chains. And I'm going to give you an example to explain that. One of the things that happened in the 1970s after the oil shocks and the oil crises was that global governments said, oil is an important commodity and we can't afford shocks in the supply chain. So countries like the US and others made a decision to hold a safety stock of about 90 days, so about a quarter of a year of oil in reserve to buffer themselves against the risk of another disruption in that supply chain. And my view is that government will start to do this for other key components in their global supply chains. Because if they did that for oil, I suspect they'll start to do it for other commodities like, and I'm going to show you my example here, for things like pharmaceutical products. These are products that we take for granted, but actually if you start to think about where these are made, a generic product like paracetamol is made almost exclusively in countries like India and China. And actually, during the height of the first wave of corona, some of these countries banned the export of the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient that allowed products like this to be made. Now, luckily, we didn't run out of these products, but in some countries, they got very, very close to running out of these products. And I suspect that what governments are going to be doing is to look for some of the other key components which are required, and they're going to make decisions about the need to hold additional inventory of these products, and also perhaps to consider where these products are made. And this comes to our next point, which is about interventionist governments. And I think what governments are going to start to do is to say, why are we, we need to reduce our risk. So it links to our next point, is to say, actually, what we need to do is we need to reduce the risk. And actually risk occurs because we rely on one or two countries in the world to make these products. So from a government perspective, I think they're going to become more interventionist. And actually, if we look back over the last 50 years, actually most governments have either been laissez-faire in the way the supply chains have been set up, or actually have been actively promoting global supply chains. So I think what we're going to start to see is a retrenchment by government and a backing off of global supply chains, a backing off of laissez-faire governance, and they're going to become more interventionist around some of the key components in supply chains. This is particularly true in global aviation. There are only two big manufacturers of planes, and that's Boeing and Airbus. And there's only one thing worse than a duopoly, and that's a monopoly. And the global aviation industry has collapsed. And I'm going to predict substantial intervention in this market to ensure the long-term viability of this market, because it's a necessary prerequisite to ensure that we recover from corona as quickly as we can. The next thing I'm going to predict is better risk governance. So some of that will be dictated by government, but some of it will be dictated by organizations. And I think that we have managed to sleepwalk ourselves into systemic risk in a number of supply chains, because we've made our supply chains leaner, we've ripped out inventory, we've made them global. And all of that has been, the last 50 years has been about reducing cost. And I think because of that, there is now systemic risk in these supply chains, and governments and companies will be stepping back and saying, actually, we need to be smarter about how we manage risk. The next force, which I've talked about already, is the impact of Industry 4.0, and particularly the automation and the de-skilling of knowledge-based work. That's going to have a massive impact on global supply chains. Big impact because of global warming. Very few of the impacts will be positive. So, for example, the opening of the North Passage that allows goods to be shipped across the top of the world because of a lack of sea ice. But also there are a number of negative events in terms of extreme weather events and other impacts on global supply chains. I think the other big one as well, which is under the radar at the moment, is the increased importance of agriculture. There's a requirement to feed more and more people because global population is increasing. But on top of that, we have global agricultural supply chains that risk disruption because of global warming. So those are my future forces. And what that means, and if we understand the forces, we can think about the things that shape these global supply chains. And I'm looking now at, what are the things that organizations will be looking at? Organizations need increased agility, increased resilience against risk, increased resilience in case things like corona come along or other global events. They want to reduce risk, and actually there's an imperative to make supply chains more globally sustainable. So those, for me, are the key changes in the drivers of global supply chains. And for me, these are the differences which I'm going to predict. And predicting in the future is always a risky place to be. It's much easier to talk about the past. So what I'm going to predict is I'm predicting that we're going to see an increased importance of islands of trade, and actually we're seeing trade blocks becoming more and more important. So we talk about the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, the European Union, which is founded on trade. the Asia-Pacific Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the African Continent Free Trade Agreement. So I think what we're starting to see is these kind of islands of trade consolidating. And what we're going to see, which is my next point, is more nearshoring. Yeah, these long extended global supply chains are becoming risky. So let's nearshore. I mean, that's possible in the European Union, for example, because there's still a labor cost differential in Eastern Europe. Yeah, and that's a global trading block. That's a local trading block that we can think about. There's a question about why Russia doesn't appear on the map. I'll come back to that. I think Russia, actually, let's answer that now. I think Russia is becoming more protectionist, and I think there's two things. I think Russia is becoming more protectionist, but also Russia is also trying to become more expansionist. So it's trying to push its boundary in Western Europe, and I think there's a move towards protectionism in Russia, but also I think there's a counter move in some countries towards reducing the reliance on Russia as a trading partner, and we're starting to see the emergence of sanctions because of some of the decisions which Russia have made. I'm treading carefully here because I recognise we're a global audience, and I'm deliberately not commenting on whether these are worthy things or not. What I'm doing particularly is talking about them in global supply chain terms. The next issue here is 3D printing. So I think 3D printing reduces the requirement for global trade because you can produce products according to demand in your local market cheaper than you can make them globally. I think we're also going to see new types of supply chain opening up. I mean, I think the classic example is something like batteries, for example, but also products like mobile telephones. You know, these all require minerals, and the ability to keep producing minerals is being reduced. I think our ability to recycle them is still suboptimal. And I'm using the term mineral library here to say that a company like Duracell, for example, will borrow a mineral off a company that produces it. They will use it in things like batteries. They will then be responsible for returning that mineral to the company they borrowed it from, who will recycle it and then make it available for other companies. So I can see an expansion in particular supply chains to cope with the requirement to be more environmentally sustainable. And I've talked about this already, but upstream value creation in developing countries is definitely a global force. The increased use of highly skilled, cheap labor in knowledge-intensive industries. I've talked about a number of these, like Huawei is an example. Actually, if you think about where some of the tech industries are being located now, Bangalore in India has been a powerhouse of IT for a long time because there are very many, very highly skilled, actually very cheap computer programmers there that people can take advantage of. And that ability actually is being exploited by other companies too. So if you were to look at, for example, Tata Consulting Services, what they do is they create a front office in countries in which they operate, which are staffed with locals, but actually some of the back-end knowledge work is done back in India because they have a highly skilled and cheap labor force. So these are some of the things which I'm predicting will happen in the next 10 years in global supply chains. Increased importance in trading blocks, nearshoring, the increased use of 3D printing, new types of supply chain, and upstream value creation in developing countries. That is my view, but I am actually really interested in what your views are because you guys are all global citizens. And I'm interested, I guess, in two ways. If you find this interesting, then now is the best time you'll get to go and do a master's or an MBA, because these are the sort of questions that we want to answer when you do your master's. Yeah, these are really, really critical ways of thinking about value creation in companies. How do we continue to create value in the long term, you know, maybe 10 years out, 20 or 30 years out, given this really, really turbulent environment that we're working in because of Corona and because of changes in technology, for example. But also I'm interested